Hello and welcome to my channel. I want to show you this landscape in charcoal. It's a nice little scene, sunset on a lake, and I'm going to take you through the drawing process. So let's have a look. These are my tools: woodless charcoal pencils, vine charcoal, and I'm going to do the sketch with a graphite pencil. It's an HB Staedtler's graphite pencil. I'm drawing the line of the water roughly in the middle, maybe a little bit lower than that, and I'm not going to be drawing any details or anything specific. I'm just doing this to work out the composition and give myself a rough idea where all of the elements will be placed. There will be some changes, but it doesn't really matter. Like I said, this is just the initial sketch. The size of the paper is about 5 × 8 inches, so a slightly smaller sketch this time. And the paper is 190 GSM smooth paper. I'm going to try something slightly different. I'm going to use this soft pastel. It's a grey soft pastel, and I'm going to use it to cover the sky. Normally I would do this either with charcoal powder or vine charcoal, but I somehow feel that this grey pastel will actually work even better. So sometimes it's a good idea to try something different, and this time I'm going to try to combine these grey pastels with charcoal. I mean, you could do the same thing with charcoal, but I feel like the pastel is going to be even easier to blend, and it's going to produce even smoother transitions. But let's see how it works. So I'm covering everything with that grey pastel, and it's a Kohinoor soft pastel stick. That's going to be my sky. I need to create a light, even tone, and I'm blending that with my finger now. Your finger is a great blending tool, especially if you're working with pastels. And you can see how smooth this is. It's hardly producing any texture at all. Now notice that I'm going around this lighter area here. That's going to be the sun. And I deliberately didn't go over it when I was working with the soft pastel. And now I'm kind of pushing the pastel dust towards that lighter area, but leaving a little bit of the white space in the middle to create a soft edge, but also to leave that lighter area so that it looks like a glowing light source. And I'm also adding a bit of soft pastel here and there where necessary. Now I'm going to do the clouds. So the clouds are going to be a little bit darker than this background, and I'm going to do that with vine charcoal. Vine charcoal is a little bit darker, and I could have also done the background with the vine charcoal, but like I said, the pastel was really easy to blend and it produced hardly any texture at all. With vine charcoal you have to do a little bit more blending, even though vine charcoal is also pretty soft and easy to blend, easier than compressed charcoal for sure. So I'm going to draw some shapes of some clouds here and there. I'm going to try to make it look like a sunset. Eventually I decided to blend with this Tortillon, and I'm going to use a combination of a Tortillon and brushes to do these clouds. But a Tortillon is not just a blending tool, it is also a drawing tool, because when it picks up a little bit of charcoal, you can use it to draw some shapes, lighter shapes, and shapes that are less defined than the ones that you would create with a charcoal pencil. So I like to use it in a combination with a charcoal pencil, because it allows me to do certain things that would be very difficult to do if I were just using a charcoal pencil. Now that I worked on those edges and shapes a little bit with a tortilla, now I'm moving in with a brush and I'm blending everything a little bit more to create slightly smoother shapes. And I'm kind of making the lower edge a little bit less defined here and there. I'm going to blend the rest of these clouds, refining their shapes using a combination of brushes and tortillons. And I think I'm already achieving a nice realistic look of this sunset sky. But that's not finished quite yet. I'm still going to have to do a little bit of work with a pencil eraser, as you will see eventually. But right now I'm kind of refining the shape of some of the clouds a little bit. Now I'm going to try to do a little bit more work with that pencil eraser. It's a Kohinoor eraser in a pencil. I sharpened it a little bit so that I can get some cleaner shapes. And I'm going to draw some highlights on these clouds because the light source is behind them, so there's going to be some highlights around the edges of some of these clouds. And like I said, I'm going to do most of that work with this Kohinoor pencil eraser. I just find it a little bit more convenient than a kneaded eraser because with a kneaded eraser you have to keep reshaping it. But the problem with this pencil eraser is because it's just a rubber eraser and a wood casing, so it does leave a little bit of residue here and there. And the thing is that when you're working with something as soft and as easily manipulated as vine charcoal and pastel, you have to be careful because when you try to remove the residue, you'll actually smudge it. So I'm trying to be careful not to mess it up, because there are a lot of these fine details here that I put a lot of effort into creating, and I don't want to ruin it. So I'm working around the edges of some of these clouds, drawing some of the highlights, making it look like the light is illuminating some of the edges of these shapes of the clouds. And I think the additional work that I did with a pencil eraser really gave the clouds a little bit more shape and made everything even more realistic, I think. I also used a kneaded eraser here and there to pick up or lift up a little bit of that charcoal where I needed a little bit of lighter value. But most of the work was done with a pencil eraser. But the sun itself, I wanted to leave that lighter, and I really tried not to put any charcoal or pastel over it. And now I'm using the piece of vine charcoal to work on this tree line. I'm just drawing some suggestions of shapes of trees in the distance, just some shapes of canopies of trees way back in the distance on the horizon, and the waterline will be just below them. So I'm going to cover this with vine charcoal, and I picked vine charcoal because I want something that will create that smoother, blurrier look. If I used a charcoal pencil, it would produce a bit too much texture. So I'm going to use the charcoal pencil for the stuff in the foreground and the midground, where I want to produce a little more texture, because more texture means detail. It's perceived as detail. We use textures to create the illusion of detail. So when you want to avoid details, you use less texture. Here I'm lifting up a little bit of that vine charcoal using a brush because I want that middle part where the sun is to be a little bit lighter. I want it to look like the glow is making that part of the tree line just a little bit lighter. The rest of it was softened with a combination of a tortillon and a brush. And I'm just going to make the bottom here a little bit darker using a charcoal pencil. And then I'm going to start drawing a few more details here. I'm just kind of blending a little bit and refining some of the details here and there. So the bank will be here on the right, and it kind of curves towards the right side. And there's also going to be a little bit of that tall grass on both sides. So I'm starting to work a little bit more with a charcoal pencil, and this is a medium charcoal pencil. But now I'm going to use a little bit more of that soft pastel to cover the surface of the water as well. It worked so well with the sky, so why not use it with the water as well? So I'm going to cover everything, and again blend that, but this time I'm going to do a little bit more work with a brush. I'm using a brush because I'm trying to push the pastel a little bit more into the grain of the paper and produce a little bit of that horizontal texture that kind of resembles the ripples, but I'm going to be adding some more details to them a bit later as I start adding vine charcoal. Now here I'm adding the reflection of these trees in the back, and the reflection doesn't have to be perfect. I'm just sort of trying to match whatever it is that we see above the water. So it doesn't have to look exactly the same, just sort of roughly match the image above the water. And I soften the edge between them a little bit, but left just enough so that it's kind of clear to the viewer where the trees end and where the lake begins. And now I'm going to draw some. I'm going to draw some ripples, but I'm going to make them so that they kind of reflect some of the stuff above the surface of the water. Like for example on this area here where the land is sticking out a little bit, so there's going to be a darker area there. And I'm also going to draw some of these horizontal lines here and there to create some suggestions of ripples on the water. But I'm going to keep them very light, and I'm going to push that vine charcoal gently with a brush, because I don't want to create texture and I don't want to create strong, well-defined, clean lines. I want to create very smooth suggestions of ripples. And you can see that I'm kind of achieving that look. There's no need to overdo it. Just a few suggestions will go a long way and help to create that illusion that we're looking at the surface of the water. And now as a final touch here, I'm going to add the reflection of the sky by using that pencil eraser again. that, I think, in combination with these ripples and reflections, will really create the illusion that we're looking at the surface of the water. So that should do it for now. I can also use that pencil eraser a little bit to go over some of these ripples to make them stand out a bit. But here I'm going to start working on these reeds or tall grass growing out of the water here. I'm going to make them go over those trees to the left a little bit, and then I'm going to make these ones closer to the middle a little bit shorter. I'm going to make it look like we have a few shorter ones that are kind of sticking out of the water. And I did most of that with a medium charcoal pencil. I softened it with a brush a bit, and then I added some suggestions of reflections under them. And the reflection needs to be kind of broken up into ripples as well, a little bit distorted as well. And I can also create some vertical reflections rather for some of these smaller blades of grass. Make everything a little more random, because we are looking at the surface of the water, which can be a little bit unpredictable, I guess, and can distort some images. And now I'm moving on to the right side, where I'm going to have some trees, and these trees are slightly in front of the trees on the horizon, so they are going to be a little bit taller, larger, and a bit more defined. That means that we're going to have a little bit more contrast, but also quite a bit more texture. And because I'm going to have a little more contrast and a little more texture, I'm using a charcoal pencil now. For that tree line in the back, I used vine charcoal because I wanted something smoother, less defined. Here I'm going to use this medium charcoal pencil. Now, just to explain quickly what I'm doing, I'm kind of using a scribbling motion just to produce something that kind of looks like a texture of foliage as seen from a distance. I'm going to be blending most of that with a tortillon, but some of that texture will still remain. I'm going to use that tortillon to refine some of the edges of those treetops. You can see that not all of it is of the same value, so I deliberately created some areas of darker value to make it look like some parts of those canopies and bushes are in the shadow, while others are kind of sticking out again and getting more light. I softened everything with a brush a little bit more, and then I was ready to move on with details on these trees. So I zoomed in again so that you can see a little bit more of the details. I'm working on these trees, on these canopies on the right, and I'm going to draw some branches in between, some of these larger boughs and branches in between these canopies. And I'm also going to draw some darker shapes around them to suggest that these are areas where there is shadow. And these darker shadow areas are very important if you want to break up that foliage into clusters, to give them a little more shape and volume. I'm also going to use a pencil eraser to poke some holes in those canopies to make it look like light is coming through the branches and the leaves. And these small touches with a pencil eraser will add a lot to the realism of these trees on the right. They will make them look like actual trees, because some parts of the background are obscured by the canopy while others are visible. Another thing that I'm using the pencil eraser for is to go over the tops of these canopies of the trees and of some of those bushes to make them look a little bit lighter and to make them stand out a bit more. And that way I'm creating some suggestions of shapes. So as you can see, the scene is coming along nicely. Now we have already achieved some depth in our drawing. We have some stuff far in the background on the horizon. We have a nice looking sky, and we also have some stuff in the midground and in the foreground. You can feel like the trees on the right are in front of the row of trees in the back, and you can feel like the grass on the left is even closer to us. And as I move on with the details on the right, we'll be able to create even more depth in this scene. Whenever you're drawing landscapes, it's a good idea to try to create that feeling of depth. And even if you're working off reference photos where you don't have stuff in the foreground, maybe you should always try to put some objects in the foreground, just to kind of give the viewer that feeling of depth. I'm going to have a little bit more of that grass near the water here on the right side as well, but it's going to be a little bit less defined than the one on the left. And I also drew some nice reflections under that part of the land which is kind of sticking out towards the middle. And I drew a little bit of shadow and reflections under the grass on the right as well. And I softened that a little bit with a brush. And in order to make the reflection match the grass, I needed to make it a little bit darker, because the reflection needs to match the image above the water, not just in terms of the position, but also in terms of the amount of value. Here I'm using the pencil eraser again to kind of define the shape of the grass a little bit more, and just adding a few darker details using a combination of vine charcoal and charcoal pencil. For this part of the bank on the right, I mostly used charcoal. I mostly used vine charcoal initially, and I spread that around with a brush and tortilla. But I'm going to be adding some texture and some value on top using a charcoal pencil, because that area needs to be a little bit more interesting, I guess. And in order to make it interesting without actually putting in too much work into drawing every single detail, I can drag the pencil over the surface of the paper, and that will naturally produce some texture and illusion of detail. But I'll later go in and maybe draw some smaller details as well, by making some suggestions of, I don't know, maybe cracks and rocks and things like that. Just a little bit more shadow here on the right. And I also need to add a bit more grass here in the foreground to make that foreground a little bit more interesting. So you can see as I'm moving closer and closer to the bottom of the drawing, I keep adding some more elements, some more smaller details, And the purpose of that is not just to make the drawing more interesting and have more details in there. The purpose is also to create a feeling of depth. Because each time you put something in the foreground, you're kind of pushing the stuff which is further behind into the background, and you're creating that illusion of distance. And here I'm using that charcoal pencil to create some indications of variation in the terrain on that bank. Maybe some suggestions of rocks and holes and cracks and things like that. And I'm further going to refine that by adding some details or areas of lighter value using a pencil eraser. And maybe even make some parts of that ground a little bit more reflective, like it's mud. So I want it to look like muddy terrain that's a combination of mud, dirt, and small stones, pebbles, things like that. Just doing a little bit more refining on those trees and adding a bit more texture in the foreground. Kind of putting down some of the finishing touches because it's almost done. I just made some small changes to the ground on the right. And I'm doing a little bit of final refining of some of these reflections and ripples and things like that. I decided to add a few branches here in the foreground to make that part of the bank a little more interesting. I'm just going to draw some dead, twisted tree branches that have fallen off, I guess. And I'm going to make some of them go over the surface of the water here. So like I said, it's all about creating an illusion of depth and distance. And as I'm putting these details in, as I'm drawing these branches, we can feel like the water is behind them and that they are in front. I'm just going to add some highlights to them using a pencil eraser to make them look more three-dimensional. And I also added a little bit of shadow under them. So these are just some of the finishing touches, but I think I'm pretty much done. I'm going to put my signature in the lower right corner, and I drew my signature using white charcoal. So that's it. That's the finished drawing. I hope you like this scene. Don't forget to check out my other videos. If you want to see longer, full-length narrated videos, you can check out my Patreon. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.